In this video, we'll look at the chilling cases of women in U.S. history who discovered that their gender wouldn't save them from the electric chair. We'll walk through the brutal crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the terrifying moments right before the executioner threw the switch. On March 20th, 1899, Martha Place became the first woman to die in the electric chair. But what exactly did she do to end up strapped into it? Let's go back to the beginning. Part 1. Martha Place, the first Brooklyn, New York, in the final years of the 19th century, was a place of rigid domestic expectations. A woman's role was in the home, tending to her husband, raising children, keeping the household in quiet order. Martha Place had followed that script for most of her life, until something inside her curdled into rage, jealousy, and finally, murder. Martha was born Martha Garretson in 1849 in New Jersey. Her early life was unremarkable. She worked as a seamstress, married young, and lost her first husband to illness. She was left to raise a daughter alone, a hard and lonely task in a century that offered widows little sympathy and even less financial support. Eventually, Martha remarried. Her second husband, like her first, would not survive her. By the 1890s, Martha had settled into a third marriage, this time to a man named William Place, a well-to-do businessman in Brooklyn. William was a widower himself, and he brought something into the marriage that would poison every day of it. A daughter from his first marriage, a 17-year-old girl named Ida. From the outside, the household on Hancock Street looked like any other respectable Brooklyn home. Behind closed doors, it was a slow-burning war. Martha resented Ida. Some accounts from the time suggest Martha felt Ida was favored by William, that the girl reminded her too much of the wife who had come before her, that every kindness William showed his daughter was a reminder that Martha herself was second in his heart. Neighbors later told reporters they'd heard shouting. Ida herself had reportedly confided to friends that her stepmother had grown cold, then cruel, then frightening. The tension in that house didn't explode all at once. It corroded, day by day, the way rust eats through iron you don't think to check. And on the morning of February 7th, 1898, it finally broke. According to the account Martha herself would later give, an account investigators found impossible to fully trust, she and Ida argued that morning. The fight escalated. Martha, in what she claimed was blind fury, grabbed a bottle of sulfuric acid, kept in the house for cleaning purposes, and threw it directly into her stepdaughter's face. Imagine that moment, the screaming, the smell of burning flesh and fabric. Ida, blinded, in agony, staggering through the house while her stepmother watched. But Martha wasn't finished. Whether out of panic or cold calculation, she picked up an axe. What followed was savage. Martha struck Ida repeatedly, the blows landing with a force that investigators would later describe as frenzied. Not the work of someone acting in a single moment of passion, but someone unleashing something that had been building for a long time. Ida Place died on the floor of her own home, blinded and bludgeoned, killed by the woman who was supposed to be a mother to her. But Martha wasn't done. She then smothered the girl's body, some reports suggest with a pillow, apparently to ensure Ida was truly dead. She dragged the body and stuffed it out of sight, then calmly went about setting the stage for what she intended to happen next. When William Place returned home from work that evening, Martha was waiting. She attacked him too, swinging the axe at her husband, striking him in the head. William, wounded and disoriented, managed to fight back and flee the house, stumbling into the street, bleeding, screaming for help. Neighbors rushed to his aid. Police were called, and when they entered the Place residence, they found something that would shock all of Brooklyn. Martha, sitting quietly, and evidence that she had also attempted to end her own life using gas from the household fixtures, apparently intending for the whole family to die that night, with her included. She survived, and so the case that would grip the nation began. The trial of Martha Place became a sensation. This was an era when the very idea of a woman committing an act of premeditated, brutal violence unsettled the public far more than a man doing the same thing. Newspapers of the period leaned hard into the horror of a monstrous stepmother, painting Martha as an aberration of nature, a woman who had betrayed the most sacred expectation of her sex, to nurture, not destroy. The prosecution built a methodical case. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The acid burns on Ida's face and chest, the catastrophic head wounds from the axe, William's own testimony about being attacked by his wife, and Martha's own inconsistent statements to police. Her defense attorneys tried to argue insanity, suggesting that no sane woman could commit such an act, that her mind must have snapped under some unknowable pressure. But the jury did not buy it. They deliberated and returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Martha Place was sentenced to death. Here is where the case became historic, not just tragic. New York State had recently adopted the electric chair as its method of execution, having first used it on a male prisoner years earlier, but no woman had ever been sent to it. The question rippled through the press, through the courts, through the public conscience. Could they really do this to a woman? Should they? There was a genuine, agonized debate. Governor Theodore Roosevelt, yes, that Theodore Roosevelt, then serving as governor of New York before his rise to the presidency, was petitioned for clemency. Advocates argued that executing a woman was an act of barbarism the civilized public shouldn't stomach, that mercy should be extended on the basis of her sex alone, regardless of the crime. Others pointed to the horror of what she'd done to Ida and argued that justice does not, should not, check for gender at the door. Roosevelt reviewed the case personally, and in the end, he refused to intervene. If the law made no distinction between a man's crime and a woman's crime, he reasoned, then it should make no distinction in the punishment either. It was a decision that would set a precedent felt for the rest of the century. On March 20th, 1899, Martha Place was led to the execution chamber at Sing Sing Prison. She was 50 years old. Reports from witnesses describe her as eerily composed, pale, quiet, resigned in a way that unsettled even the hardened prison officials who had seen men go to the chair before. Her last meal was simple, unremarkable. She reportedly ate very little of it, her appetite long gone by that point, existing in the strange, suspended dread that comes with knowing the exact hour of your own death. She said almost nothing in her final moments. No dramatic confession, no plea, no outburst. Witnesses recalled her murmuring what sounded like a prayer as the straps were fastened around her arms, legs, and chest, and the metal skull cap, soaked in conductive saline solution, was lowered onto her head. At 10:16 in the morning, the executioner threw the switch. 1,760 volts surged through Martha Place's body. Witnesses in the room, reporters among them, because in that era, executions were treated with a kind of grim publicity, described the violent convulsion of her body against the leather restraints, the smell that filled the chamber, the doctor stepping forward afterward with a stethoscope to confirm what everyone already knew. Martha Place was pronounced dead, the first woman in American history to die in the electric chair. The execution made headlines across the country. Some papers treated it soberly, as a grim marker of a changing justice system. Others sensationalized it, running detailed, almost lurid accounts of her final walk, her final words, the mechanics of the chair itself, feeding a public that was equal parts horrified and fascinated by the idea that the machine built to kill men could and would kill a woman too. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Martha Place's defense hinged on the idea that no sane woman could do what she did, that the crime itself was evidence of a broken mind. But the acid, the axe, the attempt on her husband's life, and the attempted suicide afterward all suggest something more calculated than a single moment of madness. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Martha Place deserved the same punishment as a man would have received for the same crime? Or do you think there were mitigating factors the court overlooked? Drop your verdict in the comments below, because trust me, this debate has never really gone away. Martha Place's execution cracked something open. It proved, in the coldest, most literal sense, that the chair did not discriminate. And less than 30 years later, another woman would sit in that same kind of chair, except this time, the crime, the trial, and the execution itself would become one of the most notorious media spectacles in American history. Part 2. Ruth Snyder, the Double Indemnity Murder. If Martha Place's case shocked Brooklyn, Ruth Snyder's case shocked the entire country, and it did so with a level of tabloid frenzy that had never been seen before. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a national obsession, complete with a love triangle, an insurance scheme, and ultimately, one of the most infamous photographs ever taken in American history. Ruth Brown was born in 1895 in Queens, New York. She grew up in a working-class household, and by her early 20s, she had married Albert Snyder, an art editor at a magazine, a steady, respectable, if unexciting man, 13 years her senior. On the surface, their marriage looked conventional. A house in Queens Village, a young daughter named Lorraine, the comfortable rhythm of 1920s suburban American life. But underneath that surface, Ruth was suffocating. Albert was, by multiple accounts, controlling and emotionally cold. He reportedly still kept a photograph of his deceased former fiancée in the house, a woman he compared Ruth to, unfavorably, throughout their marriage. Ruth later described the marriage as loveless, oppressive, a slow starvation of a woman who wanted more out of life than she was being allowed to have. In 1925, Ruth met a man who would change the trajectory of her life and end it. His name was Henry Judd Gray, a mild-mannered corset and lingerie salesman, married, with a daughter of his own. They met at a restaurant in Manhattan. What began as flirtation quickly became a full-blown affair, one that Ruth pursued with an intensity that would later define her in the public imagination as the manipulative femme fatale of the piece, and Gray as the weak-willed man swept along in her wake. The affair continued for nearly 2 years, conducted in hotel rooms across the city under the alias Mr. and Mrs. Judd Gray. And somewhere along the way, the relationship curdled from romantic escape into something far darker. Ruth began talking about Albert differently, not just as a man she didn't love, but as an obstacle, an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. She was, prosecutors would later argue, chillingly methodical about it. Ruth had taken out multiple life insurance policies on her husband, the largest of which included a rare and crucial clause, a double indemnity provision, meaning it would pay out double the face value, nearly $96,000, an enormous sum in 1927, if Albert died as the result of an accident, specifically one involving travel. She'd forged part of the process, getting Albert to sign paperwork without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. Investigators later revealed that Ruth had attempted to kill her husband multiple times before the murder finally succeeded, attempts involving gas, poison mixed into his food, and other quiet methods that failed to finish the job, each one written off, or perhaps simply not noticed, as unrelated illness. It painted a picture not of a single desperate act, but of a woman circling her target for months, testing, failing, and trying again. On the night of March 20th, 1927, Ruth and Judd Gray finally succeeded. Gray had come to the Snyder home while Albert slept. According to the account that emerged at trial, the two attacked Albert Snyder in his bed, striking him with a sash weight, a heavy metal window weight, bludgeoning him as he woke and struggled. When that wasn't enough, they strangled him with picture wire and, for good measure, stuffed chloroform-soaked rags near his face to make it look, unconvincingly, as though he'd suffocated during a robbery gone wrong. Then came the staging. Ruth and Gray ransacked the house, scattering jewelry and belongings, trying to construct the illusion that burglars had broken in, murdered Albert, and fled. Ruth even had Gray tie her up and gag her loosely enough to survive the night, so that she could claim she too had been a victim, attacked by mysterious Italian-sounding intruders she would later describe to police, in a story that fell apart almost immediately under questioning. And it did fall apart, spectacularly. When police arrived at the scene, something felt wrong almost immediately. The burglary was too neat, too staged. Valuable items that any real burglar would have taken were left in plain sight. Ruth's account of the intruders kept shifting in small but telling ways each time she repeated it. And then, investigators found something Ruth had apparently forgotten to hide. Sitting in a drawer in her home, in plain view, was a piece of jewelry she had claimed was stolen during the robbery. That single contradiction was the thread that, once pulled, unraveled everything. Now here's where the tension in this case really ramps up, because what happened next in the investigation is the kind of slow-motion collapse that even the best crime dramas struggle to write convincingly. Detectives brought Ruth in for questioning, and rather than break immediately, she held the line for hours, sticking to her invented story about masked intruders. But investigators had already begun quietly pulling the financial records, and what they found was the beginning of the end for her. They discovered the insurance policy. They discovered the double indemnity clause. They discovered that Ruth had taken it out without her husband's full knowledge, and that the payout would only apply to a very specific kind of death. And then, detectives did something simple but devastating. They told Ruth that Judd Gray had already been arrested in Syracuse, which was true, and implied, with practiced interrogation room instinct, that he had already confessed and named her as the mastermind. It wasn't entirely true yet, but it worked. Ruth, believing she'd been betrayed and that her only remaining option was to get ahead of the story, broke down and began implicating Gray, insisting he had done the actual killing, that she'd merely been present, that she'd been afraid of him. Gray, meanwhile, under his own separate interrogation, was doing exactly the same thing in reverse, insisting Ruth was the true architect of the murder, that she had manipulated and pressured him into it, that without her, none of it would have happened. Each of them, trying to save themselves, sealed the other's fate, and in doing so, sealed their own. If cases like this fascinate you, the psychology of two people destroying each other from the witness stand while trying to save themselves, make sure you hit the subscribe button right now, because the psychology behind our next killer is even more disturbing. The trial that followed was a full-blown media circus, one of the first true tabloid trials of the modern era. Reporters dubbed Ruth Snyder the Granite Woman, painting her as an icy, calculating seductress who had used sex and manipulation to turn a weak, ordinary man into a murderer. Judd Gray was portrayed, by contrast, as pathetic and pliable, a man who had been, in the language of the era, hypnotized by desire into throwing his entire life away. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators and journalists, including several well-known writers of the period who covered the trial as a kind of grim entertainment. Every detail of the affair, the insurance scheme, and the murder itself was dissected publicly, printed in papers that sold out within hours. Both Ruth and Gray were convicted of first-degree murder. Both were sentenced to death by electric chair to be carried out at Sing Sing prison. For over a year, Ruth Snyder sat on death row, and the public's fascination never waned. If anything, it intensified as her execution date approached in January of 1928. New York, like most states at the time, strictly forbade photography inside the execution chamber. It was considered a boundary that simply could not be crossed, a private, if state-sanctioned, moment of death that the public was allowed to hear about but never see. That boundary was about to be broken in the most infamous way imaginable. A newspaper, the New York Daily News, devised a plan. They hired a photographer, Tom Howard, and smuggled him into the execution witness room with a tiny camera strapped to his ankle, hidden beneath his pant leg, with a cable release running up his sleeve to his hand, disguised so he could trigger the shutter without visibly lifting the camera or being noticed by prison officials watching the room. On January 12, 1928, Ruth Snyder was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses described her as pale, trembling, having to be nearly carried and supported by matrons on either side. Unlike Martha Place's eerie composure decades earlier, Ruth's fear in her final moments was raw and visible. She reportedly prayed and wept as she was strapped into the chair, the electrodes fastened to her head and leg. And at the exact moment the current was sent through her body, the instant of execution itself, Tom Howard triggered the hidden camera. The photograph he captured is blurred, grainy, and utterly haunting. Ruth Snyder's body, rigid against the restraints, captured in the split second of electrocution. The photograph ran on the front page of the New York Daily News the following morning under a single, enormous word, dead. It became one of the most infamous images in the history of American journalism. A photograph so shocking, so transgressive of the line between public interest and private horror that it sparked immediate and furious debate about press ethics, about the dignity of the condemned, about what the public actually had a right to see. Judd Gray was executed shortly after, in the same chamber, in the same chair, though no illicit photograph exists of his death. History, in its strange and often cruel way, remembers Ruth Snyder's execution far more vividly than his, partly because of that photograph, and partly because, just as it had with Martha Place 3 decades earlier, the American public simply could not look away from the sight of a woman being put to death by the state. Part 3. Anna Marie Hahn, the Poisoner of Cincinnati. There's a particular kind of evil that hides behind warmth, behind a wide smile, a generous hand, a neighborly gesture extended to the lonely and the vulnerable. It's the kind of evil that is hardest to see coming because it wraps itself in the clothing of kindness, and by the time the people around it understand what they're looking at, it's already too late. Anna Marie Hahn was that kind of evil, and for years she operated in plain sight, in the heart of Cincinnati's German immigrant community, killing elderly men, one by one, while their families thanked God she was there to care for them. Anna Marie was born in 1906 in Bavaria, Germany, into a working-class family. Her early life in Europe is somewhat murky. What is documented is that she came to the United States in 1929, settling in Cincinnati, Ohio, which had a large and well-established German-American community. She married a man named Philip Hahn, and together they had a son named Oscar. Philip was employed, steady, and by most accounts, decent. But the marriage was financially troubled, almost from the beginning. A state of affairs that would quietly define everything Anna Marie did next. Anna had a gift that was genuinely useful and genuinely dangerous in equal measure. She was charming. She was the kind of woman that elderly men, widowers, bachelors, men who lived alone and ate alone and had no one to fuss over them, responded to instantly. She would show up with food she'd cooked, with offers to clean, to help with medication, to sit and listen. In the tight-knit German immigrant neighborhoods of Cincinnati, this kind of community care was normal, even expected. Nobody questioned why Anna Marie Hahn seemed to collect elderly male friends the way other women collected church acquaintances. They should have questioned it, because every man Anna Marie took under her wing had money, and every man she cared for died. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious, not because it was cleverly concealed, but because the deaths themselves were written off as natural. These were old men, in their 60s and 70s and 80s. Old men die. They die of heart failure and kidney failure and the slow collapse of bodies that have simply run their course. When an elderly man in Cincinnati died in the late 1930s with a young German woman at his bedside, no one thought to look twice. Doctors signed death certificates. Families grieved and moved on. Anna Marie quietly collected what she'd been written into wills to receive. Among her victims was a man named Jacob Wagner, aged 78, who died in 1937 and left Anna Marie around $2,000, a considerable sum at the time. There was George Gesellman, also in his late 70s, who died after Anna Marie had been visiting regularly. Albert Palmer, George Obendorfer, each one elderly, each one alone or semi-isolated, each one connected to Anna Marie through her carefully cultivated reputation as a caring, generous woman, and each one, investigators would eventually determine, had been poisoned with arsenic. Arsenic was Anna Marie's weapon of choice for reasons that made cold, practical sense. It is odorless and tasteless. It mimics the symptoms of common illnesses: stomach cramping, nausea, vomiting, weakness, progressive organ failure, meaning that without a specific toxicological test, arsenic poisoning is virtually indistinguishable from natural causes of death, particularly in elderly patients whose bodies are already compromised. In the 1930s, with forensic science still developing, and with the cultural assumption that old men simply died, arsenic was very nearly the perfect murder weapon. But Anna Marie had a problem beyond the bodies accumulating behind her. She was, at her core, reckless with money. Despite everything she stole and inherited from her victims, she gambled. She bought things she couldn't afford. She borrowed money she couldn't repay. She forged checks, writing them from accounts belonging to men who were either already dead or too frail to notice. It was this recklessness, not the murders themselves, that first drew the attention of authorities. In the summer of 1937, a check written from the account of an elderly man named George Gesellman raised flags. Investigators began pulling at the thread. They exhumed bodies. They ran toxicological tests that hadn't been run the first time around. And in body after body, they found what they were looking for: elevated concentrations of arsenic, unmistakable in the preserved tissue of the dead. Anna Marie Hahn was arrested in 1937 and charged with murder. The evidence against her was methodical and damning. Financial records showing she had benefited from the deaths, witness testimony placing her at the bedsides of the dying, the toxicology results making the poisonings undeniable. Her trial, held in Cincinnati, drew massive crowds. The newspapers ran photographs of her, a round-faced, motherly-looking woman who did not, at first glance, look like a serial killer. That was, of course, exactly the point. The mismatch between her appearance and her crimes was, for the public, the most disturbing thing about her. She was convicted of the murder of Jacob Wagner, the first conviction, and ultimately the one that sent her to death row. Later investigations would attribute at least 5 deaths to her, though the actual number may have been higher. Anna Marie maintained throughout her trial and appeals that she was innocent, that the deaths were coincidental, that she had cared for these men out of genuine affection. The jury rejected her account in deliberations that took less than 2 hours. Anna Marie Hahn became the first woman sentenced to die in Ohio's electric chair. As her execution date of December 7, 1938 approached, she mounted several last-minute appeals, all of which failed. She also, in the period just before her death, gave a written confession to a Cincinnati newspaper, a document that was to be published only after her execution. In it, she admitted to the killings, though she provided little in the way of explanation that made the horror of what she'd done any more comprehensible. She didn't confess to remorse so much as to fact. The killing had happened, she acknowledged it, and then it was over. On the night of December 7, 1938, Anna Marie ate her last meal, reportedly a simple dinner of chicken and some sides, consumed in the measured, quiet way of someone moving through the mechanics of an evening they can't believe has actually arrived. She was led to the chair just after 8 in the evening. Witnesses described her as frightened but controlled, her face pale beneath the prison lights. Her final words, spoken clearly enough to be recorded by those present: "Is there anybody who would do this to me, what I have done to others? I am so ashamed of myself." It was, by any measure, a remarkable thing to say. Not an elaboration, not a detailed confession or an expression of deep feeling. Just that, the plain acknowledgement of a symmetry between what she had done and what was now being done to her. Whether it constituted genuine remorse or simply the acceptance of an inevitability is impossible to know from the outside. The current was applied and Anna Marie Hahn was pronounced dead at 8:13 p.m., becoming the first woman executed by electric chair in the state of Ohio. In the years that followed, criminologists studying her case would note something that made Anna Marie Hahn unusual even among female serial killers: the sheer breadth of her operation, the number of victims, the sustained and deliberate nature of the predation. She was not a woman who killed in a single explosion of violence like Martha Place. She was not driven by passion or jealousy. She killed for money, repeatedly, patiently, with a method that left almost no visible mark. And she might have continued indefinitely if her financial chaos hadn't created the very paper trail that undid her. It's a case that still makes forensic historians uncomfortable, not just because of the body count, but because of how completely her warmth and perceived femininity served as camouflage for what she actually was. Part 4. Martha Beck, the Lonely Hearts Killer. There is something uniquely disturbing about a crime partnership. Two people who, separately, might never have crossed the line that separates cruelty from killing, but who, together, become something worse than the sum of their parts. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were exactly that. Two broken, desperate people who found in each other not redemption, but permission. Permission to do things that neither, alone, might have had the nerve or the ruthlessness to complete. Martha Beck was born in 1919 in Florida, and her early life was defined by hardship in ways that generated, over time, a particular psychological profile. A woman starved for love and connection, acutely aware of her own social disadvantages, willing to do almost anything for the feeling of being wanted. She was a large woman, significantly overweight from childhood, and the cruelty she experienced from other children and even from her own family about her appearance left deep, lasting wounds. She trained as a nurse, demonstrating genuine intelligence and capability in that field. She had several relationships that went badly. She had children out of wedlock, which in the late 1940s carried severe social stigma. By the time she reached her late 20s, Martha Beck was lonely in the specific, desperate way that makes someone vulnerable to almost any version of belonging they're offered. Raymond Fernandez was born in Hawaii in 1914 and grew up in Spain, later returning to America. He was a con man by trade, smooth, practiced, multilingual, with a particular skill for presenting himself as a romantic prospect to lonely, financially comfortable women. He would meet women through Lonely Hearts Clubs, the 1940s equivalent of a dating service, where people submitted letters describing themselves and their ideal partners and hoped to find correspondence that might turn into something more. Fernandez would select women who appeared to be alone and financially secure, romance them through letters and then in person, extract money and sometimes inheritances from them, and move on. He was not, at least initially, a killer. He was a manipulator and a thief, which was bad enough. In 1947, Martha Beck wrote to Fernandez through one of these Lonely Hearts Clubs. He followed his usual script, writing back, cultivating a pen-pal romance, eventually coming to meet her in person, fully intending to extract what he could and disappear. What he did not anticipate was Martha. She fell for him completely, not just infatuated, consumed. And when Fernandez, according to his pattern, tried to move on to his next mark, Martha refused to be discarded. She made clear, in terms he couldn't misread, that she would not be left behind. And Fernandez, for reasons that say something complicated about his own psychology and loneliness, agreed to take her along. They developed a system. Fernandez would continue targeting women through the Lonely Hearts Clubs, romancing them, getting engaged, gaining access to their money and legal paperwork. Martha, whom he introduced as his sister, would be present throughout, watching, participating, managing the situation alongside him. It was a grotesque, domestic arrangement. Two people who were genuinely attached to each other, playing house with women Fernandez had earmarked for exploitation. The problem was Martha's jealousy. She was pathologically unable to watch Fernandez be intimate or affectionate with other women, even women he was cynically targeting for theft. That jealousy, combined with Fernandez's increasingly bold criminality, created a pressure that eventually produced murder. Their victims' names deserve to be spoken. Myrtle Young, a woman they befriended, married off to Fernandez, and then drugged so severely that she was left in a state of incapacitation and died shortly after being put on a bus back to her family, a death ruled at the time as the result of a cerebral hemorrhage. Delphine Downing, a young widow in Michigan with a 2-year-old daughter named Raynell. Fernandez romanced and impregnated Delphine, and when she became inconvenient, when she saw too much of who they really were, Martha and Fernandez drugged her and shot her in the bedroom of her own home while her toddler daughter witnessed it. The little girl, Raynell, was then drowned in the bathtub by Martha Beck, who held the child underwater until she went still, because the child was crying and because she was, in the cold calculus of two people covering their tracks, a witness. When police in Michigan discovered the bodies, Delphine buried in the basement, Raynell nearby, and connected them to Fernandez and Beck, the couple was tracked down and arrested without major incident. They confessed, though each of them, in the classic pattern of co-defendant cases, attempted to shift the greater weight of blame onto the other. What emerged was a picture of two people so enmeshed in each other's psychology that the violence seemed, from the inside of that relationship, like a natural extension of their devotion. The Michigan murder charges initially worried prosecutors because Michigan had abolished the death penalty. Authorities from New York, where earlier potential victims had been identified, stepped in and had Fernandez and Beck extradited to stand trial there instead, specifically because New York could offer what Michigan couldn't, the electric chair. The trial in 1949 was an immediate sensation. The press called them the Lonely Hearts Killers, and the name stuck. Martha Beck, in particular, fascinated and repelled the public in equal measure. She was loud, combative, and showed no inclination toward the kind of meek, tearful femininity that might have generated even a small measure of sympathy. She made clear, repeatedly, that her primary loyalty was to Fernandez, not to the court, not to the jury, not to the victims' families watching from the gallery. She declared, at one point during the proceedings, that she loved Raymond Fernandez and that she had no shame about it. The victims, the killings, the little drowned girl, Martha approached all of it with a kind of defiant ownership that left the courtroom stunned. Both were convicted of first-degree murder. Both were sentenced to death. In the months leading up to their execution, there were appeals, stays, legal motions, the standard machinery of death penalty proceedings grinding its way forward. Martha used some of that time to speak to journalists, giving interviews that did nothing to soften her image. She was unapologetic about the relationship with Fernandez. She was dismissive about the crimes in ways that read as chilling rather than calculated. She was, for reporters hungry for a story, an endless supply of quotable hostility. On March 8, 1951, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez were executed at Sing Sing prison. They were scheduled to die the same evening, with Fernandez going first. Martha Beck's last meal was reportedly fried chicken. In her final hours, she reportedly wrote a letter, a love letter to Fernandez, which she had delivered to him before he went to the chair. Her final words, spoken in the execution chamber at Sing Sing, were brief and characteristic of the woman who had never once played to the gallery of public sympathy. My story is a love story, but only those tortured with love can understand what I mean. Then the switch was thrown. Martha Beck was dead at the age of 29. What makes the Beck case linger long after the facts have been laid out is the question of whether she was a woman who had been drawn into violence by a man who recognized and exploited her vulnerabilities, or whether she was, as many investigators believed, the more dangerous of the two, the one whose jealousy made the murders inevitable, whose capacity for violence proved, in the end, to exceed even Fernandez's own. The drowning of Raynell Downing, a 2-year-old child carried out personally by Martha Beck, is the detail that is hardest to argue away with any theory of victimhood. She wasn't a victim, she was a killer, fully, deliberately, without remorse. If you've made it this far into the video and the complete lack of remorse from these women is hitting you as hard as it's hitting me to narrate it, go ahead and hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story deserves to be seen, and it means we can keep making deep dives like this one. Because we've got one more case left, and in some ways it's the most methodical, the most sustained, and the most cold-blooded of all of them. She operated for decades. She poisoned her husband. She collected on the insurance. She poisoned another man. And then she drowned her own paralyzed son in a canoe. Her name was Judy Buenoano, and Florida's electric chair was waiting for her. Part 5. Judy Buenoano, the Black Widow of Florida. The year is 1998. The electric chair has been largely replaced across America by lethal injection, a method states began adopting in the 1980s in an effort to present capital punishment as more humane, more clinical, less viscerally disturbing to the public conscience. By the late 1990s, the electric chair is used only rarely, in states that still offer it as an option, and almost always only when the condemned person specifically chooses it. The spectacle of electrocution, the convulsion, the smell, the raw physicality of it, is something most of the justice system has tried to step back from. Judy Buenoano did not choose the electric chair. But Florida's system, at the time of her sentence, still used electrocution as its standard method of execution. And so on March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano became the first woman executed in Florida's electric chair, and the first woman executed anywhere in America since Velma Barfield died by lethal injection in North Carolina in 1984. To understand what Judy Buenoano did, you need to understand the span of it. This wasn't a crime of passion or a single catastrophic decision. This was a life built on deception, years of manipulation, insurance fraud, and methodical killing carried out across multiple states over the better part of 2 decades. She was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a serial killer. She just didn't look like the profile the public associated with that term. Judy was born Judius Lou Welty in 1943 in Quanah, Texas. Her childhood was, by any objective measure, genuinely difficult. Her mother died when she was a small child, her father was absent, and she spent years in foster care and with relatives who were sometimes neglectful and sometimes abusive. She dropped out of school young, had children, struggled financially, and navigated early adulthood with limited resources and significant instability. Some who have studied her case argue that this background is essential context for understanding her. Others argue that millions of people survive difficult childhoods without becoming murderers, and that Judy Buenoano's crimes require no tragic backstory to explain, only a clear-eyed accounting of what she chose to do. Her first known victim was Robert Buenoano, whom she married in 1971 in Florida. Robert died in 1971 of a condition diagnosed at the time as acute fatty liver disease, a death that raised no immediate red flags because he had been ill, and the attending physicians had no particular reason to suspect anything other than what appeared to be a sudden but not implausible natural death. Judy collected on his life insurance policy and moved on. She moved to Colorado, where she became involved with a man named James Butts. In 1980, Butts died of pneumonia, again, a death that did not, at the time, trigger a homicide investigation. Judy collected his life insurance as well and returned to Florida, where she would eventually settle in Pensacola and establish herself in the community as a hard-working single mother running a nail salon, involved in civic activities, by all appearances, a respectable woman raising her children largely on her own. But there was something happening in that household in the years between Robert Buenoano's death and Judy's eventual arrest that is, perhaps, the most disturbing single thread in a case full of them. Her son, Michael Buenoano, who was Robert's child, had been experiencing serious health problems for years, weakness, fatigue, paralysis progressing in his limbs. By the late 1970s, Michael was largely immobilized, reliant on leg braces to walk, and dependent on care that Judy provided. Michael Buenoano was being poisoned. Specifically, he was being poisoned with arsenic, chronic, low-dose arsenic exposure, which produces exactly the kind of progressive neurological symptoms and muscle weakness that Michael had been exhibiting for years. His doctors, who had no reason to suspect his mother, had diagnosed him with a neurological disorder. Nobody tested for arsenic. Nobody thought to. In May of 1980, Judy took Michael, who was 19 at this point, his body so compromised by years of arsenic poisoning that he could barely move without his braces, on a canoe trip on the East River near Pensacola. The canoe capsized. Michael, strapped into his braces, metal cuffs around his legs that would have made swimming nearly impossible, even for someone in full health, went into the water. He drowned. His younger brother Johnny was also in the canoe and survived. Judy survived as well. The death was initially investigated as an accident. She had taken out a $75,000 life insurance policy on Michael shortly before the canoe trip. In 1983, Judy met a businessman named John Gentry, and they became engaged. In 1983, Gentry became mysteriously ill, nausea, weakness, the symptoms you would associate with significant arsenic poisoning, though again, no one tested for it at the time. In June of 1983, a pipe bomb exploded in Gentry's car. Gentry survived, badly injured. The bomb, investigators quickly determined, had been placed by someone with access to the vehicle, someone who knew Gentry's habits, his car, and had the opportunity to install the device without being detected. The bomb was the mistake that finally cracked everything open. It was too overt, too obviously criminal, in a way that the quiet poisonings hadn't been. Police began investigating Judy Buenoano in connection with the bombing, and as they did, they started pulling on the threads of her past. The dead husband, the dead fiancé in Colorado, the dead son, and found them all connected by the same unmistakable pattern. Michael's body was exhumed. Toxicology found arsenic levels that were, by any measure, incompatible with accidental exposure. The medical history was reassessed in the new context, and what had been called a neurological disorder was almost certainly years of chronic poisoning. Robert Buenoano's case was re-examined. James Butt's in Colorado was re-examined. Everywhere investigators looked, they found Judy Buenoano at the center of deaths that had been paid out in insurance money, insurance policies she had taken out, in almost every case, shortly before the deaths occurred. She was charged initially with the attempted murder of John Gentry via the car bomb, convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Then came the murder charges related to Michael's death. The trial for Michael's murder was, in many ways, the most emotionally charged of the proceedings against her. The forensic evidence of years of arsenic poisoning in a child she had been supposed to protect was almost unbearable to hear laid out in a courtroom. Witnesses who testified about Michael's years of declining health, his paralysis, the braces he wore on the day he drowned, made the sequence of events devastatingly clear. Judy was convicted and sentenced to death. Throughout the proceedings, Judy Buenoano maintained her innocence. She continued to do so through years of appeals. She was, by all accounts, a controlled and composed presence in court. Not the loud defiance of Martha Beck, not the weeping collapse of Ruth Snyder, but a contained, watchful stillness that read either as innocence wrongly accused or as someone who had learned long ago that showing nothing was always safer than showing something. Her appeals and requests for clemency failed. Governor Lawton Chiles declined to intervene, and on March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano was led to Florida State Prison's execution chamber in Stark, Florida. She was 54 years old. Her last meal was reportedly coffee and a single English muffin with strawberry jam, a request so minimal that it struck those present as either indifference or a final, quiet statement of some kind. She wore a white dress. Witnesses described her as composed and unreadable to the end. Her final statement was short. She maintained her innocence of Michael's murder specifically, saying, I am innocent of the crimes for which I am being executed. I ask that God forgive all those who had a part in my death, and for all those who lied on the stand." The current was applied in 2 cycles, as was standard procedure. Judy Buenoano was pronounced dead at 7:13 in the morning. The first woman executed in Florida's electric chair. The first woman executed anywhere in America in 14 years. What the investigators and prosecutors in her case found most chilling in the retrospective assessments that followed was not the ambition of the scheme, though the sustained, multi-state, multi-decade nature of it was extraordinary, but the patience of it. Most killers who poison are eventually caught by the speed of their need. They take out a policy and kill within weeks, drawing obvious attention to the timeline. Judy Buenoano poisoned a child over years. She let the illness progress slowly enough that it looked entirely organic. She waited. She adjusted. She played the role of worried, exhausted mother with apparent conviction. And if John Gentry's car bomb hadn't been quite so impossible to write off as an accident, she might still be playing some version of that role today. 5 women, 5 electric chairs. 5 stories that span exactly 99 years of American history, from Martha Place in 1899 to Judy Buenoano in 1998. And if there's a thread connecting all of them, it isn't gender or method or motive. It's this. Each of them was someone the people around them trusted. Martha Place was a wife and stepmother. Ruth Snyder was the grieving widow she tried to play before the story collapsed around her. Anna Marie Hahn was the kind, attentive neighbor who brought food to elderly men who had no one. Martha Beck was, to Raymond Fernandez, devotion made flesh. And Judy Buenoano was a mother, a fiancée, a businesswoman, a woman embedded in a community that never once suspected her. The electric chair, for all its brutality and controversy, did not see any of that. It saw the verdict, and it carried out the sentence. And in each case, the sentence came not because of who these women were in the world's eyes, but because of what they had done in the moments no one was watching. Here is the question I want to leave you with today, because it's the one that genuinely has no clean answer. Of all 5 of these women, which one do you think was the most coldly calculated? Most people's instinct is to land on Judy Buenoano. The decades of sustained deception, the poisoning of her own child, the insurance schemes running across multiple states. But there's a case to be made for Anna Marie Hahn, whose charm was so weaponized it functioned almost like a system. And there's a case to be made for Ruth Snyder, who orchestrated a murder plot detailed enough to include double indemnity insurance clauses and multiple failed prior attempts before the final one succeeded. Drop your answer in the comments and tell me why. I read every single one. If this video held your attention all the way to the end, there is a video on this channel right now that goes even deeper into the psychology of calculated killers. People who lived double lives for years, fooling everyone around them, right up until the moment they couldn't. Click it now. It's exactly the kind of story you come to this channel for. And if you're not subscribed yet, after everything you just watched, what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, and we will see you in the next one.